Hello everyone, welcome to this ExchangeWire Voxpop. Delighted today to be joined by Deborah Gbadamosi, who is EMEA CEO for Brand Advance Group. Hi Debs.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Very welcome. So perhaps we could start off just with you telling us a little bit about Brand Advance Group. As I understand it, you guys work with brands and agencies.
Correct.
To try to help them access underrepresented communities and minority-owned media. But maybe in your own words, tell me what you guys focus on.
I think you pretty much nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we do exactly that. So we're an ad tech company that provide access really to underrepresented audiences and also work with minority owned and operated publishers. So it's kind of like a double-edged, I don't want to call it a sword because it's a good thing, but one side of it is to reach those audiences that normally get forgotten. And the other side is to provide equity to publishers who would not normally be on a preferred media list, if you like, because they're too small, they don't have their tech set up, and all the other reasons why they wouldn't be included. So we just make it all accessible for everybody.
Sounds fantastic. I can see why there'd just be a huge amount of value in that, both for brands and agencies, advertisers, but also for publishers as well. Like you said, trying to reach that audience, and then also for consumers being, reached out to and communicated with.
Absolutely.
Hopefully in much more of a sort of, relevant way.
Precisely, yeah. It's all about representation, resonance and relevancy, right? So making sure that there's representation in the advertising. So don't just be in a publication that's reaching an Asian audience, but also have Asian people in the ad. So there's representation. Make sure it resonates so that the ad itself is appropriate, it's authentic, it fits into the environment in which it's in, and then be relevant to the reader. Like, I want to make sure that when I'm reading it, I can it's in the right contextual environment, but also it's giving me the right messaging and it feels like it's for me. So it's all of those things combined to create inclusive and responsible advertising overall.
Yeah, fantastic. So diversity and inclusivity in advertising in general feels to me like something that's had somewhat of a spotlight shined on it in the last year or so. But I'd love to understand from your point of view where you think we're at in terms of the state of play. What have we achieved? What is next on the list of priorities that we need to tackle under this topic?
Good question. To be honest with you, there's been lots of promises, hasn't there? There's been about $740 billion pledged to be spent against diverse audiences, and of that, there's about 0.2% has actually been spent. So there's a lot of intent and good intent, but not necessarily enough follow through and action. So the kind of where we are at the moment is trying to help brands to deliver on their pledge in a it's not a self-serving mission. It's basically, you said you wanted to reach these audiences, you said you wanted to have representation, let us help you to do that. Whether that is providing you with the data to support that the audiences exist, they're there in numbers, they're big enough, they are validated. We can tell you now that there's 6% of all of Europe identifies LGBT. That's 44 million people. That's the same size as Spain. So there is scale and it's available. So we're doing a lot of that kind of, I don't want to use the word justification, but more validation of the size of the audiences. And then if you want, frameworks, how do I go about it? What's the right way? How do I avoid, being tokenistic versus how do I resonate with audiences and move the dial on creating acceptance and change? So we've got a kind of framework that we can talk to our clients about. And then equally, does the ad resonate? Is the ad good? And we can put that to a panel of people and they can tell us whether or not they're happy with it. And if they are, we can give feedback to the client. And if they're not, we can give that feedback as well. So it's just all of these different things that we're working with the brands on to help them actually deliver, and it's a lot of work, it's a lot of education. It reminds me of the good old days of digital, when digital first started, and everybody was doing digital education days. Now we're doing inclusive education days, like it's the same thing.
So I suppose, I mean, you covered quite a bit of ground there, but what would be then some of the barriers to brands who have made this pledge, are trying to reach more diverse audiences, but perhaps not able to spend the budgets that they were anticipating spending? What's holding them back from your point of view at the moment?
I mean, there'll be a number of things. There'll be just general lack of education, whether that is agency side or that's brand side. And because of that, you know, people are thinking, I don't need to be inclusive specifically because all my advertising reaches everybody, which, I mean, arguably is a fair argument, but is there representation in that advertising? Is there relevancy? Does it resonate? I mean, if it's not doing those things, then it's not getting anywhere. So there's an education piece that has to happen, and that is creating a bit of a blocker. Then there's just general, you know, budget restraints. Every brand goes through it. You know, you start the year off healthy with a big fat budget in Q1, and by Q2 you start to trim down because actually the reality hits market forces, etc. You know, we're living in austere times, etc., etc. And then you get to Q4 and you're like, oh, I better use it or I'll lose it, and then the money goes back up again. But because you've got this block in the middle between Q2 and Q3 where money isn't really being spent, it just goes on the staples. It goes to TV, trusted platforms, trusted channels. So those are the kind of sort of macro blockers. And then when you think about specifically reaching minority audiences, there's all of these legacy systems in place like brand safety that stop advertising from reaching, you know, diverse communities or underrepresented communities. So you've got keyword blocking. We see keywords from, I don't know, the time when there was a bombing with Ariana Grande's
performance
concert
in Manchester,
in Manchester, which was, you know, 5 years ago. But that keyword Manchester is still on a keyword block list. So that's a macro example, but then there are also words like Egypt that can be on a keyword block list because of uprising in Egypt in 2011, and that is still a legacy keyword that's still there. Now that's a whole audience that gets blocked, and there's more examples like that around diverse topics or politically related topics that are not necessarily negative anymore, but they are on a block list and therefore the advertising can't get through. Contextual relevance, nobody wants to be against politics or news or religion, but politics, news and religion are the things that are driving underrepresented community conversations. So now you're just, again, continuously blocking a whole set of communities. So there's all these reasons why the money can't spend. And agencies are very unforgiving, and I come from an agency background, so I know it well. If it doesn't work the first time, honestly, I'm moving on. I haven't got time to figure out whether you've got it correct or not. So because that happens, then if you tried, you know, to run advertising against a diverse audience 2 years ago and it didn't deliver, yours, as far as you're concerned, it doesn't deliver. The end. Moving on. And so you might have tried it 2 years ago and you've not come back because things have changed. There's been advancements. We've moved the programme on, but you're not open to that at the moment because you tried it before and it didn't work. So there's lots of moving parts that's stopping that money from being spent. But ultimately, it needs to be a mandate from the brands to say to, you know, everyone that manages their budgets, this is what we're doing now. Spend that money, let me see it, measure it, and make sure it's happening. And until that is a mandate, then it will always be a nice to have.
And I've so many questions off the back of that, and we've such little time, but let's just dive into that in a bit more detail. I wanted to ask you a bit about things like brand safety, the perception of brand safety against sort of, you know, keyword block lists. And then I also want to ask you a little bit more about how you can what you're doing or what you might be doing to try to encourage agencies in particular and also brands to mandate that requirement rather than just think it's a good thing to do. So on the keyword block list first, do you feel at all that a a couple of other things might be happening to refresh everyone's approach to brand safety. Firstly, that maybe culturally the world is shifting just so quickly these days. Do you find that there might be, you know, a perception, certainly from, you know, really savvy marketers within brands, that hang on a minute, we need to update these lists much more frequently than we ever did before. We also need to think about the ways in which we're trying to reach our audiences and what we're assuming to be culturally acceptable and culturally unacceptable. Is any of that having any impact on the type of, you know, work that you're trying to do to reach these audiences?
I think logically it should be happening, but it's not. And it's not because who wants to be the person that reduced your brand safety settings and then something bad happened? Nobody wants to be that guy, right?
Yeah.
So because of that, there's like, it's fit it and forget it. And everyone's kind of scared to touch it. But if you literally just give your list over to people in the know, and I'll just say, just talk to Brand Advance, for example, we can go through that list and identify what words are going to be that, you know, no longer relevant, they can safely come out, what ones are blocking content because they contain things like gay or lesbian. Like, just because a person may be gay or lesbian doesn't mean they shouldn't receive content. Why is that on a keyword block list, right? So we can look at those lists and identify the words that are actually quite safe to remove. There's not going to be any danger to your content or to your ad appearing against any content that you're not interested in having your ad against, and we can do that work. But there needs to be appetite for it, and somebody needs to be brave enough to let that happen. Some brands are doing that, some brands are. It's not moving fast enough, and it won't move fast unless there's case studies, because that's how the world of advertising works. It's like, I want a media first, but have you got a case study on that?
Yeah.
Right, so everybody needs a case study to prove that somebody else did it and they were okay.
Yeah. And surely there's got to be some brands and marketers out there that specifically want to reach diverse audiences and underrepresented communities because they've got a particular message or a particular product or a particular something that they want to target those audiences with, right?
Yeah, there are some brands that do really well in that space, like Nike, for example, have got a natural, I guess, appetite for that audience because a lot of their products are geared towards those communities anyway. Yeah. So there's no reason why you shouldn't be appearing in those types of publications. So they do a fair amount in that space. I think Meta do a fair amount as well. They're pretty good at supporting communities through the ad spends that they put there, and that obviously has a positive impact into those communities as well. Because let's say, for example, you are an LGBTQ publication who's receiving advertising spend from Meta, that attracts other brands to also work with you. So then that now creates more equity that goes going into an LGBTQ owned and operated publication, and the knock-on effects of the number of people they can employ and their families, their benefit, and so on and so on. So there are brands that are leading the way, focused and interested in reaching those audiences, and not as a token and not as a brief for diverse audiences. Like, you don't need a brief for diverse audiences. You just need a brief, and then you need to make sure it's inclusive. Yeah. The end. Yeah. As opposed to, we don't really have any briefs for you, which we've heard. Like, we don't have any briefs for you, and plus you alienate our core, so we're not going to target you. Oh, okay. Interesting. Yeah, fun times. That was the other day. Oh, God. 2023, yeah. Great. So, well, there's two things that came to mind as you were saying that. The first is that I feel, and I've chatted about it with, with colleagues in the office and also friends, I feel like a lot of advertising that I consume just in my day-to-day life over the last kind of 12 to 18 months has got more diverse, which as a consumer I find very comforting, because I'm thinking, okay, now you're speaking to everyone, not just people that look like that. Correct. So that's really nice. So you are having some impact, and advertisers are starting to do things differently. But I guess if then I was to swing round to what you just mentioned at the end there, in terms of where we need to go next, what are the next steps that we need to take? You've already mentioned we need to do something to influence agencies and marketers to mandate that a certain proportion of their budget goes towards diverse media spend.
How are we going to do that? What else do we need to do? What are some things that we should be focusing on from your perspective?
Yeah, you know what? I think we need to make it super simple and just follow. There's probably about 10 key steps that you should just follow and make those 10 key steps accessible to everybody. And you know, 1 or 2 of those steps is make sure you've got an inclusive brief and make sure you're working with inclusive planners from a creative and a media perspective.
Yep.
That means not just the people who would always plan your campaigns doing the same thing they always did, but now try and find people that look like the people in the ads that you're trying to reach. So do some of that. That's, I guess, 101. And then in terms of unlocking the funds, mandate it. Make it a mandate. If you can't hit 6%, lower it to 2%, but start. Start somewhere and follow through, measure it, and make sure you're delivering on it, and hold everybody in the process accountable.
Fantastic. Some really helpful words on improving the diversity across media and advertising. Thank you very much, Debs, for coming to speak to us.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.